So in my new book on the politics of cable television, I contend that understanding cable and the political, economic, and cultural changes it ushered in is really at the core of how we think about recent American history. And in this capacity, the 1992 election is really a transformative moment. It's the moment in which the cable television became recognized and celebrated as something different from broadcast television, and something that could actually be very politically advantageous. For the first time, a presidential candidate, Bill Clinton, made cable television a priority during his national campaign. He used programs like CNN's Larry King Live and MTV News as tools to bypass the traditional media establishment and connect to specific demographics directly. Watching his campaign in action, one journalist observed how cable was a low-cost alternative that offered a, quote, revolutionary, if obvious, development that is inevitably democratizing. Perhaps the most striking thing about cable in the 1992 election, and ultimately what I call the birth of the MTV presidency under Clinton, is not that Bill Clinton used a market-segmented and the soft news strategy to connect to new voters. It's rather the fact that it took so long for politicians like him to understand cable television's potential. And the 1992 election is really important because it validates a political idea about communication and how to connect with voters through an alternative style of media that had been ultimately pushed by the cable by the cable industry for the past 2 decades. Bill Clinton's successful turn to Larry King Live and MTV, 2 very innovative cable television programs, really expanded a cable revolution in politics and business that was ultimately 25 years in the making. My larger book charts this transformation. It starts with the era of broadcast television, and it really examines the political muscle that broadcasters used to secure a very profitable monopoly over television programming. From the 1950s through the 1980s, collaboration between broadcasters, congressional leaders, and the Federal Communications Commission created a very favorable regulatory environment that benefited congressional representatives eager to stay in the public eye of their constituents on broadcast television, and the broadcasting industry, which experienced very little competition in exchange for this very favorable coverage. Cable television as a business and as a new idea was stunted and prevented from growing in this environment. And so piercing the power of the political power of broadcasters required severing this really tight bond that they had with congressional representatives, and the assumption that that broadcasting television was the only path to political power. Bill Daniels, an early pioneer in the cable industry, recognized this. In 1969, in a memo to fellow cable operators, he urged the entire industry to recognize the, quote, public relations opportunity of offering low cost or perhaps even free time on the cable wire to all candidates. Daniels and the newly established lobbying organization, the National Cable Television Association, they sent letters to specific candidates extolling the virtues of cable television, telling them how they could reach specific demographics for longer periods of time in what they called cable casting. Throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, cable operators embarked on this campaign to educate lawmakers on how they could use the cable dial for their political benefit. This effort to show the value of cable also resulted in really innovative programming, like C-SPAN, CNN, and MTV in particular. And they all targeted different demographics, very specific demographics, with particular styles. And while Bill Daniels found that he was able to get some local or state politicians to think about how to integrate cable into their campaigns and perhaps even their administrations, it was not until the 1992 election that cable television became a key part of a national presidential campaign. And this was an opportunity that Clinton recognized, but it's also an opportunity that these cable stations recognized that could boost their business. It could be very good business to be involved in these political conversations. And that is exactly the case of what happens with MTV. With 2/3 of its audience between the ages of 18 to 34, MTV saw the 1992 election as a political and an economic opportunity to launch this new Rock the Vote initiative during the primary campaign, and then they launched a choose or lose turnout campaign during the national election. Clinton and Gore both agreed to go on MTV, and in June, they appeared for 90 minutes in a Q&A with Tabitha Soren, and it was really well received. People talked that this was the most exciting thing that had happened in that campaign to date. Notably, President George Bush turned down the show's invitation, and he stated that he would not go on, quote, a teeny bopper network. Following Clinton's close victory, the president-elect promised to expand this talk show strategy. And he told the American people that he would use satellite and cable television to continue his, quote, two-way dialogue with the people of this country. The information age, he contended, required a different type of communication and civic engagement, one that depended on cable television. And the clips that we're about to see really show this strategy in action. And what I think is really fascinating, something to think about as you're watching these clips, is how the conversation about MTV changes over time.
Bill Clinton and Ross Perot in particular learned how to go on long-form television shows. They learned how to go on everything from MTV to Arsenio Hall to Phil Donahue. And get an hour and talk to people and to avoid the sort of prosecutorial culture of the press, to avoid the condensing of their remarks to an 8-second soundbite or one paragraph in the newspaper. And it worked.
In the old media is the New York Times and CBS and Time Magazine. And the new media is MTV and Donahue and Oprah and Arsenio Hall.
Too often, we are a PBS party in an MTV world.
And it'll be hard in the MTV generation for people in public life not to be able to communicate. The nature of the issues will be such that communication and persuasion will be awfully important.
Some crimes are more violent than others. How many people will it actually affect?
Well, I hope only a small number of people.
I understand you're getting better at quick answers.
The light. That's because I went on MTV. They taught me on MTV.
On MTV the other night, one of the folks in that audience asked you about a Supreme Court appointment, and you said Mario Cuomo of New York.
I challenge a new generation of young Americans to a season of service, to act on your idealism.
It was the national anthem sung the way the kids can appreciate it, to open an inaugural ball unlike any other. In this election, the kids stepped up and participated like never before, and MTV helped them big time.
This is an expressive land that produced CNN and MTV. We were all born for the information age. Voter bill, which will make it easier for young people to register and vote, an issue that's been a big issue for MTV and all the MTV watchers in the country who want to make young people a bigger part of the political process. I'm pleased to be able to keep the promise today that I made on this Rock the Vote card, which still has my signature, back in New Hampshire.
My son and I argue about whether he should watch Beavis and Butthead on MTV. Mr. Redstone owns MTV, and he should be held responsible for Beavis and Butthead.
People who often debate these liberal conservative issues, I'll say, you don't like something, you don't have to look at it. But in fact, that we create economic and social institutions that direct things at people, that it is very hard if you dislike some of the more permissive aspects of contemporary culture. If you don't want to have MTV, you have to give up C-SPAN. And C-SPAN, life without C-SPAN is barely worth living. So we have to tolerate MTV coming into our house.
But what I found fascinating about going to MTV was that the young people were genuinely worried about their future and their country and appreciated the chance to meet with the Speaker of the House to talk about where America is going. And it was the Washington reporters who couldn't quite get it.
So there are a couple of things that I just want to highlight from this video before passing it over to my colleagues. And first is that some of the conversations about MTV that happened before the 1992 election, different media figures and the Democratic strategists, they're talking about from both sides of the political aisle, they're trying to figure out what to do with cable television, how to use this niche programming to their benefit. But there's an underlying assumption in statements that, like, we are a PBS station in an MTV world, that MTV ultimately undermines political conversations. There's a negativity that's really embedded within some of those early conversations about MTV, that politics is about substance and MTV is about style, and it's pushing us to focus more on style than substance. And this contrast between substance and style goes deep in American history. It's something that I really examined thoroughly in my first book that looked at Hollywood and entertainment in American politics. And it really becomes a way to critique a changing media environment and those who succeed in it, even while recognizing that there is a need to adapt to this broader environment. But the tone changes after the election. And cable is celebrated as that liberating tool, as Clinton himself says. There's the MTV inaugural ball that is celebrated as this great way to get young people to celebrate this inauguration. His town hall appearance on MTV in 1994, when of course he was very infamously asked if he preferred boxers or briefs. But that is part of an hour-long conversation that he has with young Americans over issues like drugs and crime. It's an hour-long conversation about policy in which he's able to command the narrative of that conversation. There's no one challenging him on particular issues. He's in control of how they're talking about these issues. And then what I think is really compelling, and I didn't know this until I actually was looking through the C-SPAN archives, is that Newt Gingrich goes on MTV in 1995, and he's celebrating. He was one of the people that critiqued Clinton for going on these talk shows and being all about fluff and style. But by 1995, he embraces MTV too, and he celebrates that this is a way that he can connect to voters and bypass this elite Washington press corps. And this really does expand on some of the archival research that I've done and the responses that people have to the 1992 election. What they see is that factor that gave Clinton that victory. And they celebrate that it's his turn towards cable. An industry magazine, which of course wanted to highlight what cable had done in the 1992 election, really hammered this point home. And it talked about how MTV, CNN, or even the Comedy Channel could provide, quote, in-depth information and opportunities for voter interactions with candidates. And so this critique of the broadcasting model and this promotion of cable as a solution to this engagement becomes really powerful after Clinton's victory in 1992. And as many scholars have noted, by the year 2000, politicians of all stripes went on soft news programming in an effort to blend this entertainment and politics and engage these non-traditional voters. And then the other thing I really want to highlight is I love the one clip that Clinton has this line about, oh, they taught me that on MTV. and in a response to how he learned to be quick with some of his responses. And I think this is a really important dynamic, to think about the ways in which experiences, political experiences on these new programs can really reshape ideas about what skills and strategies are necessary to be successful in politics. As cable television became the celebrated mode of governing and opportunity for civic engagement, politicians believed more and more that media ratings and performance was central to their political authority. And then this belief shapes how they pursue their campaigns, but also how they think about their administrations and how they're going to sell particular policies and connect while in office. So thank you very much.